Okay, good morning and welcome to the first virtual community meeting of the Massachusetts Clean Heat Standard. I am Christine Kirby, the Assistant Commissioner of Mass DEP's Bureau of Air and Waste. Also here today from Mass DEP are Will Space, Emily Lamb, and Josh Cook, all of BAW's Climate Strategies Group. First, today we're going to hear from Emily on the meeting logistics. Emily?
Hi, so just to go over a few meeting logistics for today. This meeting is being recorded and will later be posted on our website. We've muted all the participants to minimize background noise, so we ask that you please stay muted until you're participating. And then if you'd like to, please enter your full name and any affiliation in the participants panel. You can do this by opening the participants panel, clicking on participants at the bottom, and then hovering over your name and selecting the rename option. We go to the next slide. So there will be opportunities to participate in this meeting, including clarifying questions throughout, and then more substantive questions and comments in the latter half of the meeting. So in order to participate, you can raise your hand. You do this by opening the participants panel and selecting the raise your hand option in the bottom right. And you'll see that your hand is raised by the little blue hand icon next to your name. When it's your turn to participate, we will notify you by chat, announce your name, and then unmute you and lower your raised hand. You can also provide questions and comments in the chat box. And I'll turn it back over to Christine.
Great. So slide 4. Thanks, Emily. So here's today's agenda. We heard from Emily on logistics. Thanks, Emily. I also want to note that the slide deck is available on Mass DEP's website, along with other information and background material. And we'll put that link in the chat if you want to click on it and get that material. So for today, we'll start with some background information on the Clean Heat Standard. Then the second part of the agenda is to give you all an update on the stakeholder process and the input we've received to date. Next, we will provide an overview of our planned fuel supplier reporting requirements, which will be a proposed regulation. And then finally, we want to provide what we have heard from stakeholders on how the Clean Heat Standard should be designed and our next steps for that process. And then we have allowed for ample time for your questions and comments. We do expect the meeting to take about an hour, but we can stay longer if there are more questions. Next slide. Mass DEP is developing a clean heat standard to address and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the heating sector, often referred to as the thermal sector. And we are doing that because Massachusetts has very aggressive goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors under our clean energy laws and the clean energy and climate plans for 2025, 2030, and 2050. These plans are often known as the CECP. So if you hear that acronym, it means the Clean Energy and Climate Plans. And then last year, the Massachusetts Commission on Clean Heat endorsed the Clean Heat Standard as one tool to deliver clean heat to homes and buildings in Massachusetts. And I'm going to turn it over to Will Space now to give you more background.
Great. Thanks, Christine. So as Christine mentioned, we have several documents that really give us marching orders about how to approach this, and referencing the Clean Heat Standard specifically as a tool, and also the general need to promote electrification to reach our 2050 goals, and referencing the opportunities to improve all air pollution, including indoor air pollution, and improve public health. The basic idea of doing this Clean Heat Standard is that we can reduce greenhouse gases and improve air quality. We can move these clean heat solutions at a scale needed to set the pace to get to the 2050 climate goals, and also we can build in equity from the start. And that'll be a topic, not a big focus of today's meeting, but was referenced a lot in the stakeholder discussion document, and something we'll be coming back to as we get more into program design going forward. Next slide, please. So we wanted to use this first stakeholder meeting on this topic to just step back and sort of look at the question of what is a clean heat standard. What are we sort of talking about here, basically? And just talking from the graphic on the right briefly, there are a number of different things that may be considered clean heat. Heat pumps, also other clean fuels, that sort of thing. But to have a regulation and a target and a program, we need a kind of a common way of talking about all these things that let us keep track of the change and organize a regulation. So basically the idea here is that there's some sort of an application process that kind of funnels all these different concepts for clean heat into this one concept of clean heat credit. So one of the things that would happen here is we'd have a process by which, when these things happen in Massachusetts, there'd be an application that allows for an application for clean heat credits, and then those credits would have value for compliance or possibly for sale, and that would encourage people to do those projects and go through that process. So want to emphasize that a clean heat standard is a regulation. Ultimately, it's requiring the increased deployment of clean heat as demonstrated by the credits. A regulation needs to impose requirements on somebody. Sometimes we use the phrase regulated entity. In that case, it would definitely be the suppliers of heating fuels, and that might also include, at least over time, electricity. The clean heat credits, as I mentioned, would be used to demonstrate progress, and they would apply to different clean heat options with a particular focus on electricity. And the idea is the regulated entities could implement the clean heat themselves, or they might be purchasing credits from third parties, such as companies that are installing clean heat. Want to emphasize kind of about this meeting is that we have a good body of input from stakeholders, and we'll continue receiving that input on the detailed program design. We're not intending to sort of resolve or even ask all those questions at this meeting. That's something we'll do over a period of months. So the point is to acknowledge that for a lot of these things here, what is clean heat, who is regulated, there are how many clean heat credits are needed. There's still big open questions here. And the point of my presentation so far is just to get at the basic concept, which is that heating energy suppliers are required to demonstrate progress over time using clean heat credits. So next slide. So we're going to pivot a little bit. We want to focus on some particular aspects of what's happened so far in this presentation to get kind of the starting process aligned with all our stakeholders. So next slide. So we began the stakeholder process earlier this year with a detailed discussion document and some regulatory language. And the reason we started that way, instead of with a simple description, is we knew that a lot of people had a lot of opinions about a clean heat standard going in, and we wanted to get a body of written documentation about what those initial stakeholder thoughts were. And I think we succeeded for that. We appreciate, I'm sure many of you on this call were involved in that discussion. And we received 57 written comments, and those are still coming in sometimes. And our first really look at those comments, there were two things we focused on in our first review of the comments. One was in consultation with our environmental justice director, we focused on the comments that dealt with the stakeholder process. So mostly that's what I'm going to talk about for a minute now. As documented up under here, we noticed some emphasis in those comments on the need for transparency, equity, environmental justice, and just generally more information about the program. And then also some specific requests for easily digestible descriptions, more stakeholder feedback opportunities, technical sessions, and also some other engagement options. So that's really what we're focusing on mostly today, is how to move forward with that stakeholder process and what we've done so far. Next slide, Emily. So you may have been to our webpage before. Last week, we updated the webpage to include a bunch more information to look at. One are links to get to descriptions of the clean heat standard concept, including to get you to some of the documents that Christine mentioned that have served as our sort of starting point for this. As we said, the clean heat standard is referenced in our state law mandated climate plan. So it's something we're working on under that background. We also added a link to a short video explanation, sort of what a basic clean heat standard is. That's by the authors of an appendix that was one of our climate plans. So trying to make a little progress on different ways of explaining the basic concept. We've also worked with contractors to produce some technical white papers or memoranda on important technical concepts related to the clean heat standard. Those include just some background on the different technologies that can constitute clean heat and what's known about the costs. Also, some background on existing crediting schemes that affect consumer level actions, such as rooftop solar, and even some of the things in the vehicle space related to electric vehicles, and also some discussions about compliance entities with a particular focus on any obligations that might make sense for electricity suppliers. We've also posted the comments that we received, and because there were so many and we got these comments about being transparent, we also did something we don't always do in a stakeholder process, which is also post our own summary of the themes from those comments. So you can kind of look through those, and it's either reference the comments we got, and then also includes who made each comment. So that may be helpful to people trying to get up to speed on the process so far. Next slide. So we also have some plans for going forward for stakeholder engagement, and these were essentially suggested to us in the comments, particularly one letter we got from a range of organizations. So this is the first of what we're calling virtual community meetings. The concept here is that we would have evening sessions every 4 to 6 weeks of these, and the evening session makes it easier for community members to participate. We're trying to keep these virtual community meetings in the content for a general audience, so that we can help all our stakeholders participate meaningfully. And we do intend to offer time for questions and comments during this meeting. We also, and this was suggested by some commenters, intend to have a separate kind of track of technical sessions on program design. We got a list of topics, and so we're working on scheduling those and planning for those, but we do intend to do that over the summer also, to delve into some of the real details about what different things might qualify as clean heat, how we might keep track of credits, that sort of thing. And then finally, we're happy to meet with interested groups that have a request to meet with us. We've already done some of that. And, as this slide says, we're happy to have you email us anytime, both with, technical comments at any time, but also we'd love to have ideas about how to reach out better and reach more stakeholders. So that email address is also on the Clean Heat Standard website, and we encourage you to reach out with ideas anytime. So this is the first of a couple of pauses we're going to have during this, essentially just for clarification questions. So we'll have some more open time at the end of this meeting, but are there any questions that people would like just clarifying what I've said so far about stakeholder engagement? Josh, I know there were some things in the chat. I don't know if any of them are really directed explicitly at stakeholder engagement. If not, we can hold those to the end.
I think the 2 questions we have so far can be held until the end.
Okay, well, I think I'll move on then. Again, you'll have another chance at the end. So the other thing were, when we looked at, as I said, we got a very large amount of comments around a lot of different issues, including qualifying different fuels, who should be regulated, that sort of thing. And we tried to focus on a couple of things in our initial review of the comments. One, as I said, was how to do the stakeholder process. We knew that the detailed information was difficult for stakeholders, but we thought that was the way to kind of get information about the stakeholder process. But we also, in our discussion document, included much more detail on what we're thinking for fuel supplier reporting. Because in environmental regulation, we impose requirements on regulated entities, but we generally need to start with information about the background about the companies, and we need reporting in place before, at least concurrent with the implementation of the regulation. So we put out detailed draft stakeholder comment reporting language, and we're working toward moving forward with that as quickly as we can, because it sort of is the foundation for the compliance obligation. I'm just going to give a quick update on where we are on that part of the process. So we're talking about emissions reporting. MassDEP has an existing emission reporting program for businesses that and other entities that emit greenhouse gases. Applies to something like several hundred different companies now, including some small businesses, a range of stationary facilities, companies that sell energy, in this case, electricity. So we're looking at expanding that. I should make clear, we needed to go through a rulemaking process to do this. So these are sort of our initial thinking now to meet the clean heat standard requirements, but we have another opportunity for comment. So we need, as I said, the data. We're looking at this point at a quarterly reporting concept. We did receive some comments about the administrative burden associated with that, and we expect to receive more in the rulemaking process. But for reporting that has a compliance obligation or another obligation, at least quarter reporting is fairly standard. So we're still looking at that. And as much as possible, when we do reporting, we try and attach the requirements to existing kind of information that we know is already gathered in the process of normal doing business. So in natural gas suppliers, that's the billing records. In case of heating oil and propane suppliers, there's a delivery slip requirement that requires documentation of the amounts of fuel. And then essentially to get the emissions, it's just a conversion from the amount of fuel through a simple multiplication step. We are also starting to think about an online registration reporting system. So it's a fairly simple and streamlined reporting process. Next slide. So we're also working, we want to make sure we get the word out to the heating fuel industry. We already sent some flyers to a large number of companies, but we're trying to drill down on our list of potential regulated companies. So we're looking, through searching on the web and various other databases we have to come up with a list of regulated companies. We're also working with our Division of Standards, which works with the delivery slips that are required, and also the metering kind of requirements associated with producing those delivery slips. For natural gas, it's a little bit simpler because the natural gas suppliers are regulated by the Department of Public Utilities, so that's less of a burden. So that's going to be a challenge for us, but we're used to it, MassDEP regulating businesses, so that's what we do. So we're using our expertise in that area to keep that process moving forward. And as I said, there would be another we need to go through formal regulatory processes there. So part of this is identifying the list of entities to notify of those processes. Next slide. So again, we want to save any discussion or substantive discussion till the end of the slide, presentation, but we are happy to accept brief clarifying questions as we go along. So are there any brief clarifying questions about the emission reporting part of the discussion I just mentioned?
One of the questions we received in the chat was regarding a timeline for a draft regulation being released and open to public comments. and a timeline for eventual publication of the final regulations.
So I'll,
Yeah,
I'll take that one, Will. So we don't have a specific timeline yet. We go back to some of our commitments. We had a goal of finalizing regs by the end of 2023 with implementation by early 2024. That's for the whole program. In terms of the reporting regulations, we're working on that now. We do hope to pose those regulations in the next several months.
Great, thanks. So I think we'll move on again. Again, this is not your last opportunity today, and certainly not in this process for questions. I'll turn it over to Emily Lamb. She's been leading our effort to really delve into the more, all the comments, not just the two topics I mentioned, and she's going to take a minute to brief you on that work.
Yeah, thanks, Will. We can go to the next slide. So like Will said, I'm just going to give a high-level overview of some of the themes that have come out in the initial round of comments that we've received, and then I'll show you where you can find more information about them. So in general, commenters agree that the clean heat standard should be expressed and measured in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, and many commenters really emphasize the need to design the program to achieve equitable outcomes and to include options for compliance flexibility, such as an alternative compliance payment, which would allow a regulated entity to pay a fee instead of procuring a credit themselves. And then on other program design technical topics, there was really a very broad array of opinions, particularly around which technologies and fuels should count as clean heat, how credit value should be calculated. So that's sort of how you associate certain amounts of emissions with each technology, particularly around the topic of whether emissions from electricity should be included in those credit values. And then a broad array of sort of specific requests on detailed program design and implementation, such as the need for third-party verification, and the sort of the role of all the various different entities. So that's just a very high level overview to orient you a little bit, and we can go to the next slide. So like Will mentioned at the start, we've posted the comments that we received on our website, and we also posted a brief summary of the themes from those comments, which identify who made the comments as we summarized them. We will be periodically updating that because comments we're continuing to receive them. So we'll keep updating that, and you can find that on the website. And then, as we've mentioned before, you can continue to submit written comments at any time to our email address. So next slide, and I think I'll turn it back to Will.
Great. Thanks, Emily. So we just wanted to flag sort of the basic, a few things that we're planning concrete this year, and Christine already mentioned the first one. The second one is, Emily mentioned that there's a lot of discussion about what counts as clean heat, but one example that there hasn't really been any controversy about whether it should count is the electrification projects, need to count under the Global Warming Solutions Act and aren't really controversial about whether they should count. So as a kind of first step, we're looking at kind of an early action concept around getting the crediting system for electrification going as quickly as we can. And then we also hope later this year to have a second kind of comment period with a deadline around some sort of a straw program design framework that would, happen after we hold the technical sessions and at least one or maybe two more of these virtual community meetings, but where we'd sort of put out an initial kind of discussion idea that would suggest just answers and design concepts related to these different things that we've talked about. So those are our what we're thinking about working on, getting up to speed on and at right now as far as next steps. Okay, and I think we just have a last slide to kind of kick off the feedback question. So got some links here, and I think we're ready to go ahead with our general questions and comment session. Looks like we have a lot in the chat, so maybe we should start doing those. And Josh, I don't know if you're willing to read those out or.
Yeah, that's fine. So first question from Kevin O'Reilly, will RNG count towards clean heat credits?
Right, so as we said, we haven't made any decisions about that, and one of the technical sessions later this year would deal with that sort of a question.
Great. From Mary Wambui, what is the impact?
Hold on one second, Josh,
Sure.
just so, well, for acronyms, just renewable natural gas is RNG. Go ahead.
Great. Mary Wambui, what will the impact in dollars on customers' bills?
That's another question that's going to come further down the line once we know more details about the program. We would need to do some analysis along those lines as we get toward actually proposing a more detailed concept.
And I would just add that anytime we propose a regulation, we do look at economic impacts, and that would be something we would consider in our process.
And then also from Mary, just a request that there be a future meeting on bills. From Brian Davidson, how will emissions from fossil fuels that are from the power grid be accounted for?
Again, as Emily mentioned, that's another question that we need to deal with in the technical sessions and then the kind of program design process.
From Michael Ferrante, Synapse suggests that biofuel blends should be capped at B20, 20% biofuels. How does DEP justify that this recommendation is in conflict with the APS program that does not cap the amount of eligible biofuel blended with heating fuel?
I'll defer to the same thing I said earlier, which is these are all the kind of questions that I think are the reason we need to have technical sessions. But I should point out that the Synapse papers are meant to stimulate discussion and ask questions and don't represent DEP recommendations or decisions at this point.
Then from Cole Martin, to clarify, only electrification projects would be eligible for clean heat credits or early advanced clean heat credits.
So we are considering a first step that would allow early action related to electrification. We aren't currently considering an early action program for other things for reasons I mentioned, namely that electrification is called out in the various source documents, and also it seems to be the only category where we don't have a lot of controversy about whether or not it needs to count. Or maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but there's general agreement that it will be part of the program going forward.
From Heidi Clifford, and folks, if you can raise your hand, feel free to do that, and I can unmute you so you can ask your question rather than me reading your questions. From Heidi Clifford, do the reporting requirements apply to terminals who sell heating oil to wholesalers? So
the draft straw document we put out acknowledges and the discussion document that to actually determine which fuel is being delivered to homes and businesses in Massachusetts, we need to apply the emissions recording requirements to the companies that deliver to those homes and businesses. However, borrowing some previous regulatory work, we also have some reporting requirements we're looking at for the terminals that ship the fuel out that would help us with tracking and making sure that we're getting full compliance. We also have floated the idea that there may be some way to involve the wholesale part of the distribution change in streamlining compliance. So we're still open for suggestions on that topic.
From Mary Wambui, LMI customers have been left behind in climate policy for years, and despite the calculations of economic impacts, they end up paying very high energy burdens. Equity intentionality should be at every stage of the development of a clean heat standard.
Let me start on this one. So LMI is low and moderate income, and this is definitely something we're taking very seriously, and we are definitely considering equity, environmental justice into all aspects of the program. And in fact, the stakeholder discussion document put out some concepts, and Will, you might just cover those quickly at a high level. So we're definitely building that in. Will mentioned earlier, we have met with environmental justice advocates. We're working very closely with our EJ director on the design of this program. And I'll just mention very quickly that the governor announced a climate bank last week to decarbonize buildings and low and moderate income buildings in overburdened areas. So there's definitely a commitment to building that into the policy design here.
I think that's pretty much what I would cover. And Christine, just to follow up, in the discussion document, we do flag a few specific mechanisms that might be built into the clean heat standard from the beginning. I think kind of walking through those is a little beyond the scope of this meeting. I think we didn't want to get too involved in the details, but I think that will likely be a focus in one of the future virtual community meetings, is really walking through those ideas about how you make sure that some of the credits are being driving change in the low, moderate income and other disadvantaged communities by making that a sort of core requirement of the program at the beginning. And so we are very much focused on that.
From Christopher Chase, will oil and propane sellers be required to report at the customer level or just total sales for a quarter? In other words, will dealers be expected to report their customer lists?
So as I said, no final decisions have been made, but in that case, I think we can say pretty definitively, we weren't thinking of the customer list. We were thinking of the total sales, which gets used to calculate the emissions. And we even floated the idea that if a particular final delivery company is actually only delivering in Massachusetts, they might just be able to use the records of the fuel that they're receiving versus the individual delivery slip information to meet the requirement.
From Katie Eisman, we want to ensure that wood-based heating is excluded from the clean heat standard. Are you coordinating with EEA in connection with the biomass study that we understand they are conducting this year per the climate roadmap law?
Mass DEP does coordinate on those issues. The question about what qualifies, as I said, has not been something we've made any decisions on, but we do encourage people to submit written comment anytime. So if that's a important issue that didn't come in the initial comment round, you can certainly let us know about that in writing anytime. And we also hear your comment, I think, about that in this meeting, and we'll record that.
From Anna Lilja, did I understand correctly that there is no decision yet on whether renewable diesel would be eligible under the program? That's
correct. There's been no final decision there. I think the thinking, that we floated in the discussion document is the fuels that are currently qualified under APS, the waste-based fuels, seem like good candidates, but beyond that, we haven't signaled any particular or made any decisions about what else might or might not qualify. And that was certainly a topic of the comments and would be something that would be likely to come up in future technical sessions.
From Michael Ferrante, back to delivery ticketing for heating fuel and propane. This will be a huge administrative burden for these companies. Additionally, will require new regulations, correct?
The new so the delivery ticket requirements are already in place across the state, and those would form the basis for calculating the total amount of fuel delivered, which should be used to calculate the emissions. So there is some additional requirement there, but there are already existing requirements around documentation that can form the basis of those calculations. And as I said, we do understand its administrative burden. It is an administrative burden for DEP also, but we have lots of experience implementing regulations, including regulations that affect small businesses across the state. So we think we know how to move forward with that.
From Cole Martin, Argus Media, is DEP weighing any restrictions on what entities can participate in the clean heat marketplace? Will entities that aren't required companies or aren't themselves generating clean heat credits, say investors, be able to buy and sell credits, or is it too early to say?
It's too early to say.
From Kevin O'Reilly, any thoughts on a clean heat standard bill currently in the legislature? If you are already going forward with this program, what parts of that bill are needed?
I'll take that one. We don't have any comments on the legislation. We do have broad authority to propose and implement a clean heat standards. So we don't have any comments on the legislation, but we'll continue to track it. We work closely with our legislative director.
Great. Now we're going to go to Stephen Dodge. Stephen, I've asked you to unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
This is obviously a high-level briefing. I just wanted to make kind of a high-level comment. It concerns me a little bit that the thumb may be on the scale for full electrification. And obviously, this is the first of its program in the country, if it's developed. There are other successful low-carbon fuel type programs in other states that focus on transportation, but they're successful because they're really agnostic with regard to fuels. And I guess the main point I want to leave is that this really can't be a full electrification program. It really has to be a clean heat standard, and an adequate clean heat standard or appropriate clean heat standard is agnostic with regard to all fuels, because you can't electrify all sectors of the thermal heating sector right away. And the other point I want to make is just in reaction, Will, to a comment you made about the Mass APS program. And the current ban on crop-based waste fuels is really based on outdated science. I don't think there's a policy in effect in any other state that has any type of APS incentive blending, clean heat standard, clean fuel standard. And I just hope that the department looks at that, particularly with regard to costs. The best way to reduce costs, particularly for low-income communities, is to be agnostic with regard to feedstocks for biomass-based fuels that are in the program. So I know others have commented on that. We have commented on that, but I just wanted to point that out during this forum. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I think I'm mostly going to accept that as a comment, but I will just make clear that we are implementing a clean heat standard as a follow-up to 2 rounds of Massachusetts clean energy and climate plans, and also a Clean Heat Commission report. And all of those do require that we make progress toward electrification. So while there may be some aspects of it that allow other fuels to qualify, we do view it as a mandate under those documents to craft a program that does ensure progress toward electrification. But with that caveat, I think the question of what other fuels play a role, as I said, is something that's very much something we're going to be working with going forward as an open question. I appreciate your comment.
Next comment is from Carrie Catan, Green Energy Consumers Alliance. What are the thoughts at this point on the gas utility fixed cost problem?
I don't think the clean heat standard process at this point has any particular thoughts on that question.
From Brian Sora, we have customers, a good portion LMI, that were proactive in being some of the first people to install mini heat split pumps. As a result, a lot of them have had significant copper pinhole corrosion in the lines, which amounts to thousands of dollars in repairs. Is there any recourse for customers that were proactive in electrification but are being unfairly penalized due to early installation practices that have since been proven to need to be done differently?
We haven't really thought about that, but if you have ideas, we're certainly happy to hear them, but that's not something that we've anticipated.
David Lyons, Rich May PC. Thank you for hosting this session. Could you clarify the purpose of quote early action credits? Do you mean the credits would be generated for projects implemented before the regulations are effective, or that projects that are implemented earlier would earn more credits?
We haven't made a final decision of that. I don't think it's the latter. I don't think the intent was that they would earn more credits for being done earlier. But yeah, as I said, we have some administrative problems to work out with crediting electrification down in the weeds, and it's something, as I said, that we need to do. And there's also lots of precedent for getting the crediting part of a program like this up and running, you know, a little bit ahead of the compliance obligation to make sure you provide an incentive for early action, or at least not to delay. So that's the basic concept, but we haven't made any decisions about that at this point. More a scheduling update than a content description.
I don't see any additional comments in the chat or anyone with a raised hand. So if anyone has any, Ted, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah, thanks. More of a comment than a question, but Will, something you said kind of strikes me that you know, that really the two laws that give you the jurisdiction to this allow you to, you know, be broad in the authority, but there's a lot of electrification goals. And I think if that's the case, we should call it what it is. If it's a clean heat standard, let's have it be a clean heat standard. But if it's an electrification goal, I think we should call it what it is. I also think cost. You know, anyone we're talking to about this wants to know the cost. That can't come at the end. It needs to come in the beginning. You know, I don't think there's any way that electricity can't be included in the calculation. I think that's absolutely totally unfair to competing fuels. Again, all feedstocks that reduce greenhouse gas emissions need to be included in the program. Otherwise, again, it's not a clean heat standard. You know, you need to be able to allow, just like California has, just like the rest of the country has in these standards, to do the same. You know, I know there was a comment early on that the electric grid can't handle the increased load, and that wasn't, I guess, in DEP's eyes, their problem. And I understand that, but I think it's very important that we talk to the folks that do handle that and be sure that there's some idea that that's not going to be a problem down the road, because from everyone I've talked to, it is going to be a problem down the road. So also, not to understate the impact of the lifespan of heat pumps. Somebody just brought a comment about the copper lines, huge issue. Lifespan of heat pumps are going to get changed out 2 to 3 times as often as renewable liquid fuel systems. And what's the environmental impact of that? If we're going to do a cradle to grave analysis on GHG calculation with competing fuels, then I think we should do the same with what the impact of heat pumps are. And again, most of them come from countries that are not friendly to the United States. And again, if we're really looking to have an impact today, you know, we have the solution, as we've stated, in all energy and policy, not picking winners and losers. Going back to the idea of the out-of-state companies, majority of companies I've spoken to didn't receive the postcard in-state, never mind the out-of-state dealers that cross state lines. And having wholesalers submit data would be totally counterproductive. I understand, I can appreciate the thought behind that. Please engage the industry on that. There is no way that data helps at all. As a matter of fact, it probably hurts. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Next, we have Joe Uglietto. I'm going to ask you to unmute, Joe.
Hi, so I was wondering why the DEP is considering early action credits for electrification when the installation of air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps are currently incentivized in the APS program and also receive mass save rebates. So is the DEP concerned about double dipping between the APS and the clean heat standard with early action credits? And additionally, why would electrification be the only technology eligible for early action credits when technologies like biodiesel or RNG could also be eligible for early action credits and additionally are also eligible to generate credits in the APS?
I think that those are helpful comments, and you know, all of everything we're saying is open for comment. I think, you know, I think this relates a little bit to the previous commenter also. We have very clear direction from our documents to work on a clean heat standard that encourages electrification. So, and we have maybe less basic infrastructure around that than for some of the other options because of the APS program and how we're trying to move into this program. So we're trying to get out ahead of that one for the reasons I said. I guess I don't really have anything to add to it other than I think you're welcome to continue to suggest other things that maybe should be included in that effort also.
Next comment is from Doug Goodman. ISO New England has stated that there is significant investment necessary to upgrade the electrical infrastructure to support decarbonization goals, specifically calling out connecting to alternative generating sources, energy storage to shave peak demand, and just-in-time fuel supply to existing generators. Are these incorporated into this planned timeline and costs to the public?
So that's more a question, I think, about our broader clean energy and climate plan, which included extensive stakeholder back and forth, and also the Clean Heat Commission dealt with those issues. We did mention that there would need to be some sort of flexibility in this program. Whether that's one of the particular things that addresses, I don't know. But that analysis isn't necessarily part of the Clean Heat Standard work at this point, but it's certainly something we're happy to receive more information about going forward as we start to talk about the technical question of how exactly we set, annual standards on a year-to-year basis, that sort of thing. We have not, answered that question for sure at this point.
Joe, I think you raised your hand a second time, so I'm going to ask you to unmute. If that's not the case, just let us know.
Great, thank you. When looking at the transportation and electric sectors, all RPS and LCFS programs across the country that have been implemented begin with a low obligation, typically below 2%, and then slowly increase that obligation over time, maybe by 0.5% or 1% per year. These programs are designed to facilitate capital investment into renewable technologies within their sectors. And looking at historically at these RPS and LCFS programs, they've proven that once that market signal is provided and the program is implemented, that these capital investments take a significant amount of time to transform the market. So I was just curious, how could you justify placing an obligation of 29% in 2025 and 49% in 2030 in the Clean Heat Standard? It's unprecedented and is placing an extremely large obligation in a very short time frame and won't allow the market to adapt in a way you'd like it to.
Yeah, I think the numbers you're referring to are the sector-based emission limits that are in the were mandated by the legislature and established as part of the clean energy and climate planning process. So I'm not able to speak directly to those other than to confirm that we need to look at those very carefully when we think about the stringency of the Clean Heat Standard, and that we have received comments and do agree about the need to consider flexibility within the standard as we develop the requirements.
Next question from Joel Wool. Will Mass DEP working with stakeholders such as LMI housing owners, local public utilities, etc., to discuss how parties can structure or qualify for credits or aggregate projects to be credit worthy? Would geothermal qualify as a heat credit electrification strategy?
So I think the questions about the particular technologies like geothermal are in the category I mentioned, but certainly, ground source heat pumps are a type of heat pump that seem to have universal kind of support and mention in the climate plans. Josh, could you repeat the first part of the question? I'm not sure I caught the.
Will Mass DEP be doing work with stakeholders such as LMI housing owners and local public entities?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly intend to reach, work with those groups. We're always looking for connections and suggestions for how to do that. So if the commenter has some ideas, we have on the screen the email address and a request in the slides to reach out to us. And we also, as Christine mentioned, have a obligation to look at economic impacts as we move forward get to the point of actually proposing a regulation.
Question from Brian Davidson. To sum up many of the questions here, why is electrification more of a priority to the clean heat standard than actual and immediate decarbonization?
So I think the reason I've emphasized electrification, as I've said, is that it's called out in the climate plan as a long-term need for getting to 2050 and to make the progress we need to by 2050 and even 2030. The planning process really identified working as hard as we can on electrification as quickly as we can. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't additionally do other things over time, but I think the question, they can't happen instead of electrification because our clear, marching orders under the law as expressed in the climate plans are to have a program that will help us meet our long-term goals, which in the analysis we have requires electrification.
There's no additional raised hands or comments in the chat at this time.
All right, I think then we'll pause a minute, and as people are reflecting on whether they want to get one last word, I'll just mention again, this is really a kickoff of a beginning of our stakeholder process of this type, and we're happy to hear, input anytime in the form of written letters or requests to meet or questions on any of these topics. So we'll come back to additional questions that are coming up, but I'll just take the opportunity now to say, thank you for the input, and looks like we're almost wrapped up. Christine, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything for a minute now before it looks like we had at least one more question.
We have one more question, and I need to jump off in a few minutes, but I think this is exactly what we wanted to get some of your early comments. We have another meeting tonight at 6 p.m. and we will be scheduling additional meetings. There are a lot of issues and complexities to this program, and our intent is to make sure that we are doing as much stakeholder process as we need to get feedback. And as Will said, there's different ways to get us your feedback. It's up on the screen right now, comments and questions. We have our webpage, which we hope will be helpful to you folks. And if you have other folks that you think would be interested, please have them sign up for the email list, and they will be included on our meeting list. We do have some more, one more question. There's one question, do we know the date for the next session? I think we're still working on that. And then there's another question on the CHS in Vermont, which I think they're thinking about doing as well, but I don't think they're as far down the process as we are. Do you want to take that one, Will?
I mean, I think we're monitoring, Vermont and in touch with other states that are working on similar programs. And it also floated in the future meetings. We did commit in the slides to trying to hold a meeting like this every 4 to 6 weeks. So something like month to month, although in the summer that can be a tough schedule to meet. So that's what we're shooting for. So I think with that, maybe we're all set. Christine, do you agree?
Yeah, I think we should wait one more minute and then we can wrap up, and we'll be back in touch with our technical sessions and our next virtual community meeting. Okay, I think we may or may not see some of you tonight, but thank you for participating and appreciate your engagement.